Good morning, good afternoon. We're right in the middle. Welcome. I'm going to let the camera get started. We're videotaping this for those that are on the remote campuses. So anything you say will be heard by everybody.
You keep looking at me.
It's this row right here. Accounting and finance, trouble.
Amen.
Yeah, it is. So welcome, everybody. My name is Brent Alvar. I'm a professor in kinesiology. I'm a second-year professor, so still working on all those nuances of what it means to be a PLNU faculty member. The Lunch and Learn apparently is one. So thank you all for attending. Couple things. We don't quite have the technology in sync, so bear with me. I'll try to make it work. I'm working with my computer and another computer remotely, so my computer just locked up, but okay, we're good to go. So in terms of this lecture, who am I and why am I giving you a lecture on the health-related benefits of resistance training? What qualifies me to stand up here and espouse the benefits of why you, everybody in here, should resistance train? Well, that's my background. That's what I got my PhD in, was really resistance training. I studied it through my entire academic career, which is way too long, 12 years. And then I was a professor, and the area that I decided to spend my research impetus on was resistance training. So I'm going to, two things. When they asked me to do this presentation, I drew from some of my past work, so some of the research. So I'm going to share with you my own research, because that's what professors do. And then what I've done is I've scoured the literature to the best of my ability to try to find what I consider gold standard articles. So articles and studies that really will hopefully share with you why we all collectively should resistance train. I'll ask you for a show of hands. You can be honest, I won't take it personally. How many of you currently do any form of resistance training? Okay, so we have some work to do in the room. I would say that was about 15% of us probably currently resistance train. I'm going to see if I can elevate that number, or at least pique your interest and convince you that you should, for a myriad of health-related reasons. That's my goal for today. I want to get you interested. There's going to be another lecture in about another month where Jacob Gooden, another professor, first-year professor in kinesiology, is going to come in, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about how to get started. So today I'm going to lay the foundation. Next month, Jacob's going to come in, and hopefully he will give you the tools to get started. With that said, if you have questions or you want to come and talk to me, I'm open to meet with any of you, all of you, to talk about resistance training, about programming, anything that you need for your exercise-related needs. So in terms of what I've done in the past, I ran a fitness center when I was going through my PhD and my master's training, so I'm very familiar with how to prescribe exercise. I'm a certified strength and conditioning, so my ABCs up there, as my daughter calls them, that means that I've spent a lot of time getting certified. All those little asterisk D's mean I do a lot of presenting in my professional arena, centered around strength and conditioning, and my new area is around tactical. So I work with military, I work with the U.S. military, specifically as kind of a consultant. I work with San Diego Fire, I work with a couple different fire agencies, and then I work with some police agencies as well, some of the government agencies, to help them kind of come to grips of how they should train their occupational resilient employees to do their job at a higher level. We won't go into that. That's a whole different arena. But for today, my goal is to teach you, one, a little bit about how I got involved, and then this is a picture of me back when I was a young professor. Times change, unfortunately, so do hairstyles. I actually would prefer to go back to that, but that was a long time ago. But what I'd like to do is kind of talk you through how I got started and then where we are today. But so why did I get into the health-related benefits of resistance training? I was a former athlete, really interested in how to get athletes stronger. Wasn't really interested in health. Was the farthest thing from my mind. But my colleagues at Arizona State said, hey, if you want to work here, you better start having a little practical applicability to health, because that's what this department is centered on. So I took my research and then kind of pushed it into the realm of how do we make people stronger, and what does making people stronger have to do with health? So think in those terms as we progress. So, how do we get people stronger? That's the question. And I'm going to share with you some initial research that I was involved with. This is the first 10 years of my career, if you can believe it. 10 years, one study. About 6 doctoral students along the way. Well, all of my students, all of my time was dedicated on that one question: how do we get people stronger? If you, for those of you that do or don't know, we have guidelines that are put forth by professional associations that kind of create these goals for getting people active. What does it mean in terms of their health? And for resistance training, there was a goal that was to get people to do one set of resistance training, 8 to 10 different exercises, 1 to 2 days a week. That was the goal. And I said, that's ridiculous. That is so minuscule. It's not going to have any effect, especially when I'm talking about sport athletes. So we spent 10 years trying to elucidate what the dose response is to resistance training and strength. That's my whole area of research in a nutshell. So will different doses, so think of taking a medication, different doses elicit a different response. So if you have a headache, if you take a half an aspirin, might have a little effect. If you take a full aspirin, might be getting there, but if you take 2 aspirin, knocks it out. Well, for me, what I was trying to argue is that maybe if we do a little resistance training, it's going to have a little effect. If we do a little bit more, might have a greater effect. But if we really hit the optimal dose, that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to share with you, and this is not my aspirations to have you optimize your resultant gain in strength. That's really not it. What I'd like you to do is get active. But we're going to start by looking at how to optimize strength, and then I'm going to talk to you about how it's going to have an impact on your overarching health. So here's the first slide. First slide. This is 10 years of work. This is a culmination of 140 different studies, all put together in a meta-analysis. So my lab, we analyzed all the research that had ever been done in the world on resistance training, and we put it in one overarching study. It's called a meta-analysis. And we looked at how effective resistance training is at eliciting alterations in muscular strength based on, the first thing is how much resistance training do you need to do? And I'm going to I'll share with you a couple points. The black bars for those of you that don't do any resistance training. That's you, the black bar. What I want you to notice is that if you do one set of resistance training, the minimum dose, one set, 8 to 10 exercises, it'll take you about 15 to 20 minutes in a gym. It'll have a huge effect. A huge effect. However, if you do a little bit more, 2 to 3 sets per exercise, so now we're talking about 30 to 45 minutes, you're going to more than double your resultant gain in muscular strength. For me, that's important. When I'm prescribing exercise, I want to know what's the cost benefit in terms of time and in terms of your resultant strength gain. So, having said that, remember when I started, I wanted to hammer that you needed to do more than that single set. My takeaway was that single set is really effective. So that's my message to you. First take-home message. One set, 8 to 10 exercises is the minimum dose to elicit a very large resultant gain in strength to you. How long does that take? 15 to 20 minutes in the gym. So for those of, what's the number one reason people don't exercise? Time. So I'm telling you, you can go to the gym, you can do one set and be done in 15 to 20 minutes. It will alter your muscular strength significantly, over 1 standard deviation greater. If you are moderately trained, however, you're going to have to probably do 3 to 4 sets to elicit that continued response that you got at 1 set as a beginner. Let me explain. If you've been resistance training for more than a year, your body adapts to that stimulus. And if you want to stay at that level of strength, that's fine. You can continue to do 1 set. However, if you want to have an increase in your strength, you're going to have to do a little bit more. That dose needs to be a little bit greater. Okay? And then if you're an athlete, so we quantified untrained, trained, and then athletes, those that were at the collegiate, professional, or elite level, so those that were in the Olympics. Guess how many sets it took? You can see on the screen, but how many sets did it take them to optimize their resultant gain in strength? 8 sets. 8 sets. Now, that some of you are going, that's ridiculous. 8 sets is ridiculous. But I would say it's not 8 sets of the same exercise. It's 8 sets of exercise on the same muscle group. So for example, if I was doing squats, I could do some squats, I could do some lunges, I could do some deadlifts. It all equates to the same basic muscle groups, and that's how I get that resultant gain. So that's volume. So when we talk about volume, yes ma'am, question.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if you could define what you're defining as resistance training and give an example.
Yeah. So resistance training can be anything you want it to be. Resistance training can be body weight. So push-ups, sit-ups, planks, jumping jacks, plyometric step-ups or step-downs. Anything that utilizes an external, it could be utilizing a band. If I hold a resistance band and it works against me as I do my squats, that's resistance training. If I go to the gym and I work with dumbbells, dumbbells are the individual handheld weights. If I work with dumbbells, if I work with barbells, if I work with selectorized equipment, that's where you put the pin in the piece of equipment. All of that is resistance training. All of that will have slightly differential effects on you, but the most important thing I want you to know is they're all effective. And when I say getting started, that single set, I don't care what you do. It doesn't matter. The resultant gain will be elicited by just doing that minimum dose.
When you say set, you said that was 8 to 12 exercises
Yeah.
within one group?
Great question. So what is a set? A set is a grouping of repetitions for an exercise. So for example, when I'm designing, and this is what Dr. Gooden is going to talk about when we talk about how to prescribe exercise. So when I say 8 to 10 exercises, I want to pick exercises for each segmental body part. So for example, I want to do something that maybe works my calves, something that works my quads, something that works my hamstrings, something that works my abs, my glutes, my pecs, my biceps, my triceps, maybe even up into the neck, so shoulders, okay? Each one of those would be an exercise, right? A set would be one group of those exercises for a number of repetitions. For example, if we're doing, let's say, bench press, and I say I want you to do 8 repetitions, and you do 8 repetitions, that's 1 set. Clear? Good question. So when I talk about the minimum dose for health-related gains, 8 to 10 exercises, 1 for each body segment, 8 to 12 repetitions, 2 to maybe 3 days per week. Doesn't sound like too much, does it? That's the trick, though. You got to do it. You got to do it. You got to do it. Okay, so that's volume. So volume, a couple things when you look at the slides. What you'll notice is there's twice as much gain from going from 1 to 3 sets for my untrained group. There's about another half if I go from 1 to 4 sets for my trained group, and then there's another about half when I go from my single to 8 sets for my athletes. What I also want you to recognize is that to get the same response as that single set for my untrained population, it takes 3 to 4 sets for a trained population and 8 sets for athletes. That's the dosage. So having said that, do you need to progress from 1 to 3 to 8? And the answer is no. As long as we do that single set and get stronger, we can maintain that next level of strength. But what I'm telling you is if you want to get to the next level, it's going to take a little more volume. In addition, we can talk about intensity. When we talk about intensity, it's the same thing. For beginners, it's about 60% of your 1 repetition max. What's a 1 repetition max? The maximum amount of weight you can lift one time. And then when I say 60% of that, that means you can lift the weight about 12 to 15 times. If you can lift the weight, let's say I want you to do about 60% of your 1 repetition max, and you decide your first exercise is going to be bench press. When you get to about 15 repetitions, when you go for that 16th one, it should feel like it's a little bit too much. Okay? So that's about the range for 60%. For a trained population, it jumps up to 80%. That's about 6 to 8 repetitions. And then for my elite athletes, they go upwards of 85 to 90%. So we're really talking 3 to 5 repetitions. Yes, ma'am.
What's on your y-axis, like the 0 to 3?
Those are effect sizes. So effect size, I don't want to go into statistics, but an effect size just basically is when I look at all of these different studies, what I did was quantify them in a way that made the actual denomination irrelevant. So basically, it tells me how effective the treatment is, so how effective that resistance training program was at eliciting a change in strength. That's what an effect size is. So that's what that y-axis is. That's a great question. Make sense? Yes?
You mentioned, so for like lifting the weights, you said 60% of the max weight.
Mm-hmm.
Would that apply for body weight exercises you do 60%
Yeah.
of your total?
So what I would say is yes. However, for some body weight exercises, we're not going to be able to add resistance in a way that mimics what we would do for a free weight exercise. However, we can do some things to try to do that. For example, that's where bands come in. So I can take a resistance band. For example, if I'm doing a squat and I can get different sizes or resistance of those bands to try to elicit a similar intensity as what I would get with a free weight exercise. Are there ways to do that, for example, if I'm doing push-ups? Can somebody give me an example of how I might add additional resistance to a push-up?
Just put weight on your back.
Put weight on your back. Perfect.
Or you can use the same resistance band, wrap it around.
Use the same, put it around your hands and then push up against that resistance. Exactly right. So there are ways to mirror what we're trying to do in a gym without spending money on a membership or costly systems. Great questions. Okay, frequency. What I want you to see here is a couple things. 2 to 3 days per week for our untrained population. It's better to get 3 days per week. However, with 2 days per week, you can see that linear increase in strength. But we're going to optimize a resultant gain in strength by doing 3 days per week. However, it's only one set, right? 1 to 3 sets, 3 days per week. For our trained population, now we're getting into 3 to 4 sets per exercise. If we do more than 2 days per week per muscle group, performance actually drops. Why do you think that is? Overtraining, good. Yeah, it's too much. The body can't respond to that level of intensity with that frequency and that amount of volume in a way that an untrained person is. So because we raise the intensity, the body can't tolerate that level of volume. And it's the same thing, you can see the same for athletes. And when we start getting into those higher volumes, we have to start doing things like splitting up the way that we work out. So we get into, instead of doing full body resistance training programs, we start doing split routines. Okay, today I'm going to work upper body. Tomorrow I'm going to work lower body. So we may have to work out more days per week, so it gets a little more complicated. Okay? Again, very simplistically, 2 to 3 days per week, 1 set per muscle group is a great place to start. As we progress, we can increase the amount of volume that we do, and we can change up the way that we organize our resistance training programs if we want to advance in our frequency. But we're not going to work out those same muscle groups more than 2 days per week as we advance in our training program. Does that make sense to everybody? Yep. Okay. So the conclusions of my 10 years of research. There is a progressive nature in resistance training. Our body adapts to these different stimulus. And when I was doing this research, I was just out of a very competitive time in my life. I was lifting weights, and that's why I had anecdotally a problem with advocating for single set resistance training. However, my research clarified to me and to the body of literature that yes, it can be very effective, but as your training experience increases, the amount of volume, frequency, or intensity needs to change with you if you want to see continued adaptations. So that's the background. You guys now have probably a graduate level understanding of how to prescribe exercise. Now I'm going to try to convince you why it's important to actually understand resistance training. So the reason we had to get through this is you need to understand some of the nuances of the terminology. What I'd like to convince you is that resistance training can have a myriad of health-related benefits. Hypertension, cholesterol, metabolic syndrome, quality of life, bone mass, diabetes, and more. Resistance training has been shown to be effective at not only causing positive alterations in these disease processes, but it can actually prevent and reverse some of the symptomologies of these disease processes. That, for me, is really important. Why? In my family, I have osteoporosis with my mother and my mother's side. I have issues with diabetes. My uncle is diabetic. My father is hypertensive and has issues with cholesterol. So these are and you guys should have an understanding of where your family history plays. What are you at risk for as well? And then we can try to look at these and program in a way that will prevent or at least retard the progress of some of these disease processes. So I know this slide's a little small. I tried to blow it up a little bit, so we'll see if it actually works. Okay, some of the things that make sense for why we should resistance train. This was a review of literature that looked at a comparison between resistance training and cardiovascular training. I'm going to argue that resistance training is better. Why? Because I'm not a fan of cardiovascular training. Simple as that. Simple as that. Okay, so some of the things that make sense, right? Percent body fat. If I resistance train, what happens? I lay down more musculoskeletal mass, right? I put down more muscle mass. So what happens? My body composition gets better. Okay, makes sense. I get stronger. Logical. And I have theoretically more local muscular endurance. These are the things that make sense with resistance training. What are some of the ones that maybe aren't as pertinent or logical? Physical function. I would argue, and I worked in a nursing home for 8 years doing exercise prescription for individuals that had various cerebrovascular issues or cardiovascular issues or orthopedic issues. And my job was to try to prescribe exercise to return them to independent functioning. So I would argue resistance training is far more effective at doing that. And I'm going to share some research that points to that as well. But independent living and basal metabolism. And I will argue, yeah, there's not a huge increase in basal metabolism. Those of you that think that you're going to lift weights and it's going to put on muscle mass and you're going to become this machine that burns fuel all the time, it's not that great. It's about 40 calories to 100 calories a day. I wish it were more, but I'm going to be honest with you, that's not the reason we do it. You do burn more calories. Now think of 40 to 100 calories every day over the course of 365 days. Now we're talking, right? But it's not a short-term benefit. So don't think that you're going to start resistance training and the pounds are just going to fall off. I would probably say pounds might actually go up because you're going to increase lean muscle mass before you start to drop fat mass. So just words of caution. And I want you to be, we have trainers out there that may try to snake oil you. So I want you to understand that we need truth in advertising here. Okay, what else? Okay, Bone mineral density, osteoarthritis. Bone mineral density makes sense, right? If we lift weights, we can actually start a hormonal cascade that increases our bone mineral density. And I would argue this happens regardless of age. Regardless of age. We can resist. Now, the most important age to be doing it is, especially for females during that adolescent time period where we have the greatest hormonal possibilities, I would argue that those don't end post-adolescence. We can continue to have bone mineral density gains, and we can also slow that bone mineral density loss over time as well. Osteoarthritis, it's counterintuitive. If we have osteoarthritis, we do resistance training. We think we're going to do additional damage to the joints. Research shows that we actually can reverse some of the damage that we have with osteoarthritis. Why? We actually generate additional muscle mass that protects the joints and reduces some of the implications that are surrounding the joint. Insulin sensitivity, I'm going to share some research about that. Serum lipids and endurance time, which is another one. You would think that cardiovascular conditioning would increase your endurance time. So if I said, hey, I'm going to put you on a treadmill and I'm going to see how far you can go and how fast you can go, if I told you that resistance training would enhance that, you'd probably think I was crazy. I'm going to share some research that proves that in a way that will probably make sense to you. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the research. Again, these are some really cool studies that I found that hopefully will point you in a direction that makes sense. So physical function, the first one, this is out of the Cooper Clinic, which is in Texas. It's a big research unit. Ken Cooper was kind of a pioneer. He started the whole jogging craze back in the day in the 70s. So anyway, that's who he is. He has this institute, and they studied about 3,500 men and women, and they tracked them for 5 years. So they brought them in, they tested them, they tracked them for 5 years. Interestingly enough, they had a huge spectrum of age, 30 to 82 years of age, and what they found was a couple things. Those that were in the lowest quartile for strength, in the men and women, had significantly lower treadmill time. So they brought him in, they did cardiovascular testing, and those in the lowest quartile or in the lower quartiles for strength had lower time on the treadmill, regardless of gender. Statistically significant differences. Why do you think that is? Out of shape? Now, what they actually feel is that you need a certain level of muscular strength regardless of cardiovascular. We all have cardiovascular capacity, right? Some of us go up and down the stairs, no problem, right? Some of us go up the stairs and it sounds like we just ran up, I don't know, the hill coming around the corner to go out of campus. We need a certain level of strength to actually do cardiovascular conditioning. So think about that for a minute. You need a level of strength to actually optimize your capacity as a human being to do aerobic conditioning. And those that were in the lowest level of strength didn't have the capacity to do cardiovascular conditioning. In addition, they tracked these individuals over those 5 years, and what they found in terms of physical problems is there was a statistically significant difference in the amount of physical problems. So orthopedic problems, inability to do certain tasks in that five-year follow-up based on their level of strength. So I would argue that if you don't have the level of strength necessary to even engage in life with a bit of vigor, it can have a huge implication on your quality of life and the reduction of these functional problems. So another huge reason to stay active. It took me almost 10 years. I ran a fitness center for 10 years and I couldn't get my parents to resistance train. It took me 10 years to get them to finally come in. After 10 years, they started coming. 2 years later, both of my parents were like, why didn't we do this sooner? I don't know. All right, so maintenance of strength through your lifespan can actually reduce physical functioning problems. That's a huge benefit and something for us to think about. My credo in life, why a resistance train, I'll share it with you. I want to die young. Think about that. I want to die young at a very old age. Okay? I want to be able to do the things when I retire that maybe I don't have the time to do now. I don't want to be that guy that retires. I think it's going to be at 72. And I don't have the capacity to do the things I want to do. So that's why I resistance train. That's why I resistance train. I want to hit life running when I have the opportunity, regardless of my age. Okay, and there's a threshold of strength necessary to fully engage in activities of daily living and to prevent illnesses and issues throughout our life. Okay, hypertension. Who can tell me the new blood pressure guidelines? Who can tell me? They just changed this year. Who can tell me the old blood pressure guidelines? What's stage 1 hypertensive? 140/90 was the old stage 1 hypertensive guidelines. The new guidelines are 130 over anything over 80. What does that mean? It means that almost half of our population is now hypertensive. Half of our population is now hypertensive. Why is that important? Hypertension is a precursor to cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular diseases. So it's a precursor to heart attack and stroke, the number 1 killer and the number 5 killer of Americans. So this is our red flag, right? Hey, we're hypertensive, something's going on vascularly, and we need to address it. What I'm going to argue is that we can reverse some of the implications with hypertension by resistance training. Okay. Here's another meta-analysis. The overall baseline systolic blood pressure of the individuals in this study was 131.6 millimeters of mercury. So systolic was what? Stage 1 hypertensive. What did they find over the course of the study? A -6 millimeter of mercury drop in blood pressure. So what did they do? They brought them back into the normal range. For diastolic, 80.9 millimeters of mercury. So again, we're barely, but we're in that stage 1 hypertension for diastolic blood pressure. By resistance training, they were able to drop by 5 millimeters of mercury. Now, this is a culmination of a bunch of different studies, so we can't really talk about how long was the intervention, but some of the interesting findings were that just moderate resistance training. So what I explained to you, single set, about 60% of your 1 repetition max, is probably enough to have this type of a benefit for you. So those of you that have, how many in here have family that are hypertensive? Okay, everybody else raise your hand. We all do, right? There's over 50% of the population. So if your mother doesn't have it, your dad probably has it, there's somebody in your family that's hypertensive. You are at risk for hypertension. So I would argue this is a great way to probably prevent some hypertension. And it's independent of aerobic exercise. So those of you that do aerobic exercise, that's going to have a benefit in and of itself. It's a different complete mechanism for hypertension and for a lot of the different issues that I'm going to talk about. So what about cholesterol? Does resistance training benefit cholesterol? This is a study that looked at the comparison of walking at about 70% heart rate versus resistance training, 1 to 3 sets, 8 reps, 8 exercises. That sound familiar? Yes. What did they find? Total cholesterol, same effect, -10 in total cholesterol. Is that a good occurrence? Yeah, that's significant, right? What happened to the control group? The control group actually went up 12 points. What about LDL cholesterol? -6 for aerobic training group, 3 times as much for a resistance training group. Do you see why I picked this study? Maybe I cherry picked this one a little bit, but HDL cholesterol, similar benefits, right? HDL cholesterol is the good cholesterol. It's the one that goes out and gathers other cholesterol and dissipates it for you. So that's the positive cholesterol. Similar benefits. Triglycerides, slightly better drop in triglycerides with resistance training. So again, resistance training. Those of you that aren't resistance training, I'm telling you, we now have blood pressure, right? We've got physical functioning, and we have cholesterol and triglycerides that we're making an impact just by doing a minimum amount of resistance training. So both have an effect, and I would argue are independent as well. So favorable changes in our blood lipid profiles and our triglyceride levels. Okay, diabetes. We all know what diabetes is, and I'm specifically speaking about type 2 diabetes, the one that's more environmentally reactive, meaning it's based more on low levels of physical activity, low levels of engagement in probably resistance and cardiovascular training, poor diet, smoking, and alcohol consumption. Probably also related to stress and sleep patterns, but that's not talked about quite as much in the literature, but it's what we're seeing with some differential populations. And it's a huge problem in the United States. Diabetes, I'd say, is I think 17 million individuals in the United States are diagnosed with diabetes. However, they think that that's 50% below the individuals that just are not getting screened to know whether or not they're diabetic. So it's a silent killer, just like hypertension. Okay, does resistance training have the ability to increase insulin sensitivity? So basically diabetes, what happens is our body loses its ability to utilize and then generate insulin. So our blood sugar gets crazy. Our blood sugar goes up. That's why they do a blood sugar test. They tell you to fast, and then you come in first thing in the morning and you do a blood sugar test. Your body isn't producing insulin, so your blood sugar levels stay high, right? That's the problem. So this study, they looked at 17 previously sedentary obese diabetics. They trained 5 days a week for 4 to 6 weeks, 2 sets, 9 exercises, 10 to 12 repetitions. So a little more volume, right? But still, only 2 sets, only 9 exercises. We're talking less than 30 minutes of activity. And what I want you to see is look at that result on their blood glucose. The grouping on the right are those that resistance trained, and the grouping are on the left. The grouping on the right is our sedentary individuals. No change. Huge alteration in insulin sensitivity, increased by 48%. 48%. Now, I'll share one more study with you a little later that, if we have time, that goes into this a little bit more. But what I want you to tell you is that by resistance training, these are obese individuals. So individuals that already had precursors for full-blown diabetes, and we can actually instigate this reuptake of insulin utilization. Okay? That's huge. That's huge. And I'll share, I did some research on the Sacaton Indian Reservation with some individuals that were pre-diabetic, and we actually brought them back from actually progressing into full-blown diabetes. But I'll share that if we have time a little later. Okay, Syndrome X. How many of you have heard the term Syndrome X? If you haven't, Syndrome X is this categorization of lifestyle factors that leads to huge implications for morbidity and mortality. So it's risk factors that lead you to the development of diabetes. So abdominal obesity, high triglycerides, low high-density lipoproteins, high blood pressure, and high fasting glucose, all in combination. So these individuals are at huge risk for the development of diabetes and premature morbidity and mortality. So this is a study done out of that same, or by JERCA, asymptomatic men, so they didn't have diabetes. They were 20 to 80 years old, and there were 3,233 men in the study. What I want you to understand, this is the incidence rate across different age categories. So the y-axis is percent of individuals, and the x-axis is different age groupings, 20 to 39, 40 to 49, and 50 plus. So, and the different color schemes are low to high strength. And what do you see regardless of age category? The lower your quartile, and those are 4 quartiles of strength, low, low, moderate, moderate, high, and high. The lower your quartile for muscular strength, the higher your risk for metabolic syndrome. The higher your level of strength, the lower your risk for metabolic syndrome, regardless of anything else, regardless of your activity, regardless of your diet, regardless of your family history. These are all independent risk factors. So if you are stronger, there seems to be a protective effect. Okay? So men in the highest strength category had a 34% lower risk of developing metabolic syndrome than men in the lowest strength category. Here's the second study. This is 8,000 men, kind of similar. They tracked them, but they measured actual 1 repetition max, and they measured their cardiovascular fitness on a stress test. I love this slide. This is probably one of my favorite slides in my career. What I want you to note is that on the y-axis is percentile of occurrence. The x-axis is muscular strength, and the z-axis is cardiovascular fitness. So what we're looking at is the impact of muscular strength and cardiovascular fitness on metabolic syndrome. And what do you see? Anyone? As your muscular strength and as your cardiovascular fitness go up, your risk of metabolic syndrome goes down. They are independent on reducing your risk of metabolic syndrome. And that's why I love this graph. You can see it because it's 3-dimensional and it's falling off on both axes. That to me is extremely telling. So what I argue with people all the time, if they tell me, hey, I do cardiovascular exercise, I don't need to do anything else. I would argue there's additional benefit to be had for your health by engaging in resistance training. Similar, I do cardiovascular training. I hate it. I feel like a plodding elephant when I do my cardiovascular training, but I do it because I know it has an important benefit to me. Okay. So both are independent, even among obese or overweight and obese individuals. So regardless of your weight, your BMI, your body fat percentage, doing resistance training and doing cardiovascular fitness can benefit and prevent the onset of cardiometabolic diseases. Okay? This is huge because I will tell you, for individuals that are overweight or obese, what would I start with? Cardiovascular exercise or resistance training?
Resistance training.
Why? You're exactly right. And it's not just because it's me. It's easier. It's easier. And if you're a little heavier, like me, you're going to be stronger and you're going to be successful. And I can alter your muscular strength in about 3 to 4 weeks. You're going to be stronger in 3 to 4 weeks. So you're going to see gains very, very quickly. Okay? So that's why I would start with that. Okay. We've got about 15 minutes. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Question.
I'm curious, does body weight stuff, like yoga,
Mm-hmm.
to build strength, count as resistance training?
It does count as resistance training. Now, I say that there are different styles of yoga and different levels of intensity of yoga. However, you are supporting your body weight, and there is some level of resistance training. The more, and I don't know I can't name out the different forms, the forms of yoga that actually place a greater intensity of body weight while doing the yoga are going to have a greater effect. But those that are slow and flow, probably not going to have the same level of effect, right? Is that fair? But yes, absolutely. Body weight exercises can be very effective.
Can I ask a practical question?
Absolutely.
Because, so I don't have a gym membership.
Yep.
I don't know, how many of you have do not have memberships? Raise your hand. Okay, so here's the question, because I'm convinced that resistance training is hugely important. A family that does have high blood pressure,
Yeah.
hypertension, diabetes, all of it, you
Yep.
name it, right? So I'm thinking, I want to go home and I want to start doing
Yep.
resistance training. So 50% of us in this room don't have gym memberships. What's
Yeah.
a practical way to take
Yeah.
everything that you said today and to apply it tomorrow? Like, can we go buy certain things that are
Yep.
pretty reasonable?
Yep.
How would you start us off if we never have done this?
Now, I don't want to steal Dr. Gooden's thunder because I'm not sure what he's speaking about. However, I will give you, so I wrote an evidence-based guideline for starting resistance training. And what I utilized was bands, and I utilized milk jugs with water, and I used socks filled with bags and sand that used so you can use those as ankle cuffs or as wrist cuffs. You can use 2 jugs of water and you can fill them up differentially based on how much resistance you need. You can use bands. They're very inexpensive. You can go to any of the sporting goods stores, Walmart, Target. They all have these resistance bands, and they're different gradations. So they're different levels of intensity based on the size, and you can do all of the exercises that I would prescribe, that Dr. Gooden will prescribe to you, utilizing very simplistic, very inexpensive tools and apparatus. I don't advocate people going to a gym. I advocate people getting active and doing resistance training. If that's at home, in fact, probably the biggest impact I ever had was working with older adults that never wanted to step foot in a fitness center. Now, if you do want to go to fitness center, I can help you there too. There are things that you can do at a little higher level in a fitness center. So if you want to talk about that, we can talk about some other time about how to design and progress appropriately at a more advanced way. But that's not to say you can't do some amazing things at home with little to no cost. You know, think of if you go to Costco and you buy those jumbo cans of, chili, nacho cheese, whatever you buy, those things are fantastic as counterweights that you can use. I used to, when I had young children, I used to use my children as my tools because I didn't have time to go to the gym either. I now use my dog. My dog weighs about 65 pounds. He is not a fan of it, but it makes it that much more fun. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Here's a study that I did, and I want to share with you. This is the study I did with pre-diabetics. And what we did was we looked at the different levels of intensity and volume, and would it have a differential effect on glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity. And what I want you to know is that it did. So for glucose uptake, what I found was that intensity was the most important factor. So higher intensity resistance training was really good at eliciting a glucose response. So what that means is there's a different mechanism for the way glucose is taken out of the bloodstream and utilized by the muscle. So if I want to work on glucose specifically, so let's say individuals, you go and you get your diabetic check, and they say, yep, you're pre-diabetic. So you've got some issues controlling your blood sugar. Intensity of exercise, so doing things that are a little higher in resistance, probably, so instead of doing 12 to 15 repetitions, maybe doing something that you can only do 8 times is going to be better for glucose uptake. However, if you want to have long-term implications on your insulin, so your body's ability to produce insulin, what I would advocate is greater volume. So this research shows that the higher the volume, the more effective it is. However, the higher volume and the higher intensity for insulin sensitivity is the most prevalent. Why? They think that it has to do with not only a hormone cascade, but it has to do with muscle protein synthesis. So not to go too deep, I'll make it very simplistic. In the body, we have white and red meat, correct? Just like our turkey, right? White and red. The white meat is those of us that do resistance training. That's what we're actually changing. We're changing the size of that white meat. So that's why our turkeys have lots of white meat, is because they're resistance training turkeys, right? They don't do any flying, right? Do turkeys fly anymore? The answer is no. So they're resistance training turkeys. So for those of us that do lots of resistance training, we're going to change the muscle protein synthesis of that white muscle. And that's why we think that that's what's going to elicit this hormonal cascade and alter the protein synthesis for white muscle. Okay, enough physiology. I don't want to bore you. So there does appear a dose response with pre-diabetics in both glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity, but it's slightly different. So just a couple more studies, and then I'll quit, maybe with 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'll answer questions as long as people want to stay and ask questions. But I want to make sure that I'm sharing as much information as I can. This is a cross-sectional study that looked at resistance training, but basically HbA1c is your indicator for diabetes. So it's a 30-day retrospective analysis on your body's ability to regulate your glucose. And what this study showed that is resistance training had a significant effect on HbA1c. It also reduced systolic blood pressure, and it also reduced fat mass. And this is in a huge meta-analysis of 13 randomized controlled trials. So what I'm telling you is it can be very effective. And then here's another one, cross-sectional study, the NHANES study, for those of you that follow those types of things. Metabolic syndrome among people who lifted weights was 24 compared to 37% for those who did not lift weights. So lifting weights, after they did an adjustment for a couple factors, 37% reduction in the odds of getting metabolic syndrome by doing resistance training. One last thing that I want to talk about is cancer. And I know cancer's that scary, the C word, that scares a lot of us. This was a research study that was recent, came out last year. And I think it's really important to note that they found that they studied 80,000 individuals. This is a huge study, 80,000 individuals. Those who did strength training just twice a week were almost a third, 31%, less likely to die from cancer than their counterparts who didn't resistance train. So think about that. If we can reduce our risk by becoming now, so why is that? I would argue that there are some, I had to take a horrible immunology class in my grad program, and I was stupid enough to think that I could study immunology and resistance training. I won't bore you with those details, but suffice it to say there are some immunological factors associated with resistance training. So, and I think that's why we have some protective benefits associated by engaging in resistance training, specifically related to cancer. So the overall likelihood of dying from cancer dropped by 23% as well. So not only did it prevent the actual onset of cancer, for those who actually had cancer, the mortality rate went down by 23%. And finally, those that were diagnosed with cancer, it found that moderate exercise and aerobic exercise almost halves the likelihood of dying from cancer. So again, there appears to be an independent benefit from resistance training and cardiovascular training related to cancer, morbidity, so getting cancer, surviving cancer, and then actually re-engaging without cancer. So last thing, mortality. So in this study, about 30,000 adults were studied for 15 years, only 10% resistance trained. Resistance training reduced their early death by 46%. So there's something about, remember, we're going to die young at a very old age. And if this last slide doesn't tell us that that's possible, I don't know what slide will. So my overall hope for this presentation is that I've at least presented you with information, compelling information, that resistance training can enhance your quality of life. It can reduce the symptomologies associated with a myriad of disease, prevent some of those diseases, retard the progression of those diseases, and actually reverse some of those disease processes. And with that, I think I'll just one more thing. Dr. Gooden is on May 7th, so he's going to come in and talk to you about how to get started, and I'll give him a little precursor that we need to be thoughtful about our exercise prescription and our utilization of alternative techniques for getting active. But he's on May 7th, so put that on your calendars. And with that, I've got a couple minutes to take a couple more questions. Anybody have any final thoughts? Thank you. Question?
Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of yours is more like a low intensity resistance training.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see similar effects for high intensity interval training like the CrossFit series?
Yeah, HIIT training is, so there are a couple things with HIIT training. I would argue that the higher end of the spectrum of what I've showed would be more related to high intensity interval training. That stated, we have to be cautious when we talk about high intensity interval training. There are some definite benefits in terms of metabolic processes and some of these disease processes. What some of the research shows is if we don't allow for adequate recovery in between those high intensity interval training protocols, it can be deleterious rather than positive in terms of overall health. Just like if we train for things like marathons and triathlons and things that if we start pushing the envelope in terms of our training, we can actually have a negative implication if we're doing too much too soon. So, are there positive benefits? Absolutely. If we train up progressively and we allow our body to adapt and we overload our system appropriately, high intensity interval training with adequate rest and recovery is extremely effective and can have many benefits related to overall health and engagement in life. Great question. Yes?
I have to run, but would you be willing to send the PowerPoint to those of us that are interested?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's
Yep.
great. I'll write down my email for you.
Yep, perfect.
Thank you.
I'll make sure that we get it on our website.
Oh, you're gonna put it out?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. We'll put it on the website. So the question was if I would present the PowerPoint, and we'll put the PowerPoint up on the website for everyone. Other questions? Yes?
As a follow-up regarding it, and also just regarding the number of times per week doing high intensity. So what is adequate recovery time?
So the question is, how long do we really need to recover from a high intensity interval training program? So the general thought is minimum 48 to 72 hours between a high intensity workout, specifically if we're working the same muscle groups. Now, if we're doing differential exercises, we may be able to reduce that time interval a little bit, but I would argue if it's like a CrossFit style workout, maybe 2 times a week might be enough. You might be able to get that third one in, but we've got to maybe 3 one week, 2 the next week to allow for adequate recovery between workout sessions. So, and the reason there's a hormonal cascade that happens when we do too much workout, it's like not getting enough sleep or not getting the appropriate nutrition, so we can actually have a really negative implication with our body. And we see that, so the reason I say that, we see that with our military and with our firefighters and our police officers, so we have to be cautious in the way that we prescribe exercise. So listen to your body. There are some tools technologically that we can use to actually track some of those things, and if you want to talk about that offline, come and see me, we can talk about that. Other questions? Yes?
I've heard it's better to do higher weights for shorter reps, and then I've also heard it's better to do more reps with lower weights.
The question is, should we do higher weights with lower reps or lower reps with higher volume? Let me answer that specifically. To begin with, we're going to do lower intensity, higher volume of training to allow your body to adapt to that new training stimulus. As you progress over time, we can add additional intensity that your body can then tolerate that additional load. So there are definite benefits to high intensity, high weight resistance training. However, we have to prepare our body to be able to tolerate those high loads. So to begin with, very low intensity, higher volume training is very effective. And you don't have to, so it also increases our risk for injury. So we want to prepare ourselves. So start low and slow and you'd be good to go, as they say.
Am I correct in thinking that higher repetition, lower intensity workouts are more of a toning kind of a workout, and higher intensity are much more of a muscle building?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that yes, as we progress. However, early on with resistance training, the most benefit is going to be neural. So we train our body how to tolerate these loads and our neural system, so our nerves. And so if you try something new, are you very good at it to start with? And the answer is no, we're not. So in a weightlifting move, like when we do a bench press, it's really shaky to start with. Within a couple sessions, that movement becomes very fluid. That's our neurological system actually accommodating to that resistance. So early on, it's neither toning or actual hypertrophy. And hypertrophy is the terminology we use for increasing muscle size. We're actually having neural gains. Now, with low volume, lower intensity training, we will have alterations in muscle mass early on. And then if we want to have continued alterations, yes, we need greater intensity and greater volume over time. So, great question. Any final questions? Or I tell you what, I'll stick around. We'll end there because we're a little past time already. I'll stick around and answer any questions that you guys have as long as you have. But feel free to reach out to me via email or call me, and I'm happy to meet with you offline as well.